November 2019. The mouth of the Myall River, Australia. 7,500 tons of rock are dropped onto a dead sea floor. But if the goal is to restore an oyster reef, why are they bringing stone instead of oysters? A year later, scientists recorded a number that is hard to believe. 50 million juvenile oysters settled on the new substrate on their own in the first summer. And what followed is even harder to accept. They filtered the water, restored clarity to the bottom, and transformed dead silt into a living reef, complete with fish, crabs, and sea urchins. But the strangest part is this. Sydney restaurants had been collecting kitchen waste for years so that a living reef could grow from it. And that path turned out to be far more complicated than it appears. So how did it happen? In 1770, Captain Cook entered Botany Bay and made the first official European written record of what he saw beneath the surface: reefs. They were large, dense, and visible from the deck of his ship. The first colonists who followed him described the oyster reefs in Sydney Harbor as a navigational hazard. There were so many that vessels had to navigate around them. In Port Phillip Bay alone, in the south of the country, the reefs covered a quarter of the entire sea floor. Then the colonists needed lime to build Government House, warehouses, and prisons. There were no limestone quarries nearby, but the reefs were right there, underfoot, in the shallows. Shells were gathered, burned, and converted into lime. For Sydney, building itself brick by brick through the 1800s, the oyster reef was simply a quarry that happened to stand in water. Then came dredge fishing. In the 1950s, scallop dredges swept across Port Phillip Bay and ground down whatever remained. Then came the turbidity from land clearing and river catchments. Then disease and invasive species. The result, documented in a peer-reviewed 2018 study published in PLOS One and widely cited since, was that 94% of Australia's oyster reefs had disappeared since European colonization. Of what Cook had described, 6% remained. To understand the scale of that, there is an American precedent that makes the number tangible. Chesapeake Bay, the largest estuary in the United States. At its natural peak, the oysters there filtered the entire volume of the bay. 19 trillion gallons of water in a single week. All the water in 7 days. That meant crystal clarity, seagrass beds on the bottom, fish in every arm of the estuary. Today, the Chesapeake population stands at less than 2% of its historical level, and that same mass of water is no longer filtered in a week. It takes a year, 52 weeks instead of 1. That is what the loss of 98% looks like. Australia lost 94%. The 4% difference is not grounds for optimism. It simply means that certain processes in Australia have not gone quite as far yet. By the early part of the decade that began in 2010, scientists were finding only a handful of scattered colonies of the flat oyster Ostrea ungasi on the muddy edges of channels, barely visible. The official status, functionally extinct, meaning the species still exists, but is no longer capable of performing any role in the ecosystem. Empty silt where a living reef once stood. This is where Charlotte Jenkins enters the story. A biologist with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries Fisheries, who moved from early field measurements to economic justification and became a co-author of the cost-benefit analysis that ultimately determined the funding fate of the entire program. The idea that she and her colleagues at the Nature Conservancy Australia began to advance sounded almost provocatively simple. Give oysters a hard surface, and they will come back on their own. Just give them something to hold on to. The skeptics were not silent, and they had their reasons. The first question was, where would the larvae come from? For an oyster to settle on new substrate, it first has to arrive as a larva, drifting in from somewhere nearby. And for that to happen, adult oysters capable of reproducing must exist in the vicinity. If the population has been nearly destroyed across hundreds of kilometers of coastline, who will produce that seed? A perfect substrate without larvae is just expensive rock on the seafloor. The second concern was simple. Mud does not hold. Even if you place hard material on a soft estuarine bottom, within a few seasons it will sink, especially in locations with strong tidal action and soft sediment deposits. And the third, the hardest to answer, was that this had never been done before. Not in Australia, not with this species, not in tidal estuaries, and not at this scale. The Nature Conservancy had experience with similar projects in Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. But Sarcostraea glomerata, the Sydney rock oyster, is a different species with different larval behavior. The skeptics were right about the details. They simply could not see the full picture. 2015. The first pilot was purely experimental. The team was testing one thing: would anything survive at all on a dead bottom? Simply dropping oysters into the water did not work. Larvae could not attach to silt. They needed a hard surface. That raised the question, what should that surface be made from? The answer came from an unexpected direction: from restaurants. The mechanism they devised worked like this. The Nature Conservancy Australia launched a program called Shuck Don't Chuck. Restaurants, seafood markets, and catering companies began collecting used shells, oyster, mussel, scallop, and handing them in rather than sending them to landfill. The shells went to a quarantine facility where they sat for a minimum of 6 months to eliminate pathogens. Then they were taken to a hatchery where oyster larvae were raised on them under controlled conditions. Then the seeded shells were transported to the restoration site. In parallel, scientists were solving the substrate problem. Limestone gravel and stone foundations were what could withstand the settling pressure of a muddy estuarine bottom. In 2019, when funding finally arrived from the state government and the Federal Reef Builder Initiative, a barge carried 3,300 tons of rock and 180 cubic meters of recycled shell into the mouths of the Myall and Karua rivers. The shell was sourced from local oyster farms in Port Stephens. The Shuck Don't Chuck restaurant program was running simultaneously in other states, places where farms had nearly disappeared and the only source of shell was urban hospitality venues. But the skeptics raised one more question. Sydney rock oyster, shell or stone, which holds spat better? Jenkins and her team answered it in the field. They laid parallel plots, some with rock alone, others with rock and shell, and counted. 2 years later, the results were published in BMC Ecology and Evolution. Spat density on bare rock in the Myall River was 1,790 individuals per square meter. On plots with shell, it was significantly lower. Rock turned out to be the better substrate. But there is a question that hangs in the air after all of this. If the skeptics were right, where did those 50 million larvae come from, if the population was nearly gone? The answer exists, and it explains why the team chose Port Stephens specifically rather than any other dead stretch of seafloor along the coast. In the Myall and Karua estuaries, remnant reefs had survived. They were still reproducing, and larvae were entering the water each year. They simply had nowhere to settle. Silt does not hold, and the larvae were dying. The Department of Primary Industries chose the site by exactly that criterion. Where larvae are already in the water, that is where we put the rock. Port Stephens had a naturally high level of larval settlement. That was a precondition verified in a small pilot back in January 2019, a full year before the full-scale installation. The team placed test plots measuring 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter and simply counted how many larvae would settle in a season. Enough settled to justify 3,300 tons of rock. So the answer to the skeptics was not that they were wrong, it was that they were right. And that is precisely why we chose this specific location and not just any site. That was an unexpected outcome for a team that had invested considerable effort into the restaurant shell collection program. Shell remained in the project, but as a supplementary material rather than a primary one. The first summer after the reef was laid down, in 2020, scientists counted the colonies. 50 million oyster larvae, naturally without forced seeding, settled on the new foundations. After 2 years of monitoring, the reefs were filtering water at a rate of 7.5 million liters per hour. That is 3 Olympic swimming pools every hour, for a reef less than 3 years old. Natural reefs of the same area filter slightly more, but the gap is no longer catastrophic. Fish abundance in the restoration zone increased by 10%. Fish species diversity increased by 15%. Then came the cost-benefit analysis, published in 2024. The project cost was $3 million. The estimated net present value to society was $40 million. The benefit-to-cost ratio was nearly 14 to 1. Scaled up, the next level delivers a net present value of $81 million, with a benefit-to-cost ratio exceeding 15 to 1. What appeared alongside the reef, though, surprised everyone. The team had expected filtration. They expected improved water quality. They expected the oysters to survive or not survive. What they did not expect was fishermen. Dusky flathead and yellowfin bream, both popular recreational fish in Port Stephens, began concentrating around the new reefs. Scientists attached acoustic tags to 20 individuals of each species and tracked their movements over 120 days. During that time, they recorded more than 100,000 positions. It turned out that dusky flathead move into the shallow reef at high tide, sheltering among the rocks and shell, and retreat at low tide. The reef had become a shelter and a feeding ground. Fishermen noticed before the scientists did. People who had been fishing the Mayal estuary for years, and who knew exactly where nothing ever was, now knew where something was. And here arose a question the team had not anticipated as a problem. Fishermen began catching fish directly on the restoration plots, on the reef itself. Acoustic tracking had shown exactly where the flathead and bream were concentrating. Fishermen were reading the same water and arriving with lines and nets. From an ecological standpoint, this is good. The reef is working, the fish are there, people can see results with their own eyes. From a management standpoint, it is a new variable that no one had built into the model. If fishing pressure on the site increases faster than the reef can stabilize, the restoration could slow down, because people with nets had appeared around it. DPI recorded this. There is no answer yet, only monitoring. But the fact itself reveals something important. The moment an ecosystem begins to recover, it immediately draws human interest back to it. And human interest is always both a resource and a pressure at the same time. The reef attracts fish. Fish attract fishermen. Fishermen attract attention to the reef, and that is the only reason the local council agreed to support the next phase of funding. But they also create a load that must be managed. A closed loop. Oysters in Port Stephens are an industry. In 2019 and 2020, commercial oyster farming in the region generated $10 million per year. By 2022 and 2023, that had fallen to $6.9 million. The causes vary: disease, storms, and dredging works. But the overall picture is one of instability. The restoration reef, from the government's perspective, is infrastructure for everything. For the water quality in which farmed oysters grow, for the fish that recreational fishers catch, and for the tourists drawn by dive sites. But convincing fishermen and farmers of that at the outset was not easy. Without their support, the project could obtain neither permits nor scale. Charlotte Jenkins and the team spent years, before a single stone was laid, in negotiations with fishing clubs, the local council, the Warimi Local Aboriginal Land Council, and aquaculture representatives. The reef at the mouth of the Mayal was not built from rock alone. It was built from agreements. That is the heart of the project. There is one detail that illustrates this better than any statistic. When the restoration was complete, the Warimi conducted a traditional smoking ceremony on the water, quite possibly the first in history performed directly on the surface of the bay rather than on shore. The two new reefs received official names in the Warimi language: Bindaimaguba Ninang and Garawaguba Ninang, Black Possum Oyster Home, and Oysters of Sea Country. The reef exists in an ecosystem, and now it exists in a language. Because the greatest challenge in restoring marine ecosystems anywhere in the world is not biological, it is managerial. If a community does not believe in a project or believes in it but sees no benefit for itself, the project will not scale. It remains a beautiful pilot that earns published papers, and then the funding runs out. In Port Stephens, for now, that problem has been resolved. But for now is an important qualifier. Today, the Reef Builder Initiative, the Australian federal program that funded Port Stephens, covers 13 sites across the continent, from Botany Bay to Oyster Harbour in Western Australia. The goal is to restore 30% of the former range of oyster reefs. 30% of the 6% that remains after a 94% collapse is the minimum threshold above which an ecosystem can theoretically sustain itself. And now a question without an answer. In Waganga Inlet at Narooma, a different type of project has just been launched. a living shoreline. It is the first attempt in New South Wales to restore a subtidal reef of the flat oyster Ostrea angasi, the same species considered functionally extinct across most of its former range. The team used a remote settlement method. 2 million larvae raised on prepared shell in a hatchery and then planted out. Predation mortality was high. The following season, they changed the protocol. Juveniles were kept in the hatchery longer, then deployed in mesh bags. 600,000 new individuals. The survival rate is still unknown. Nobody knows whether a species absent from a given location for hundreds of years will actually take hold. Does an ecosystem remember what it is missing? And if predators consume the second seeding as well, the team does not yet know whether there is a third option. And a parallel question for any project of this kind is who pays once the grant funding ends. Port Stevens cost $3 million. The next phase costs more, and there are 13 sites. The reefs are growing. They are filtering water. They are drawing fish, but they cannot persuade the next government to release the funds.